can imagine, a really cool picture of the galaxy and the universe with a voice that only Brandon Batson can do. Be thoroughly impressed. So we've got this is the week sandwich between Christmas and New Year's when everybody goes on vacation. Pastor Russ is in South Carolina with family. Pastor Brandon is in Pittsburgh, where it's far colder than this frigid Bakersfield weather. Pastor Mark is in Louisiana, who got to take his son to a bowl game. Awesome. And just like about the third or fourth day after Christmas, when you're down to the dregs of the leftovers in the fridge, you get me. Now this is normally when you take a smell test to see if that food is still good. Too late. Too late. This morning, here's how well this is going so far. This morning we had a cable go bad, that's why you got no lyrics today. We're doing it old school. We had 10 children's workers call in, besides they couldn't come, and 7 of our hospitality workers. And our 3 pastors are all around the country. So, it's amazing that church still happens and God's kingdom is still coming. Alright, let's go through a couple things. The first thing is, we're going to recap what we've been doing the last 3 weeks. We're in the last week of our Wonder series. So we've been looking at the wonder of God, how we go about losing our wonder, and then how we go about getting it back. So 3 weeks ago, Pastor Russ talked to us about coming to God like a child. And we went through this journey with Pastor Russ, and we talked about what it is that with childlike faith, it causes us to have such wonder in God, and then what it is as we progress in our faith with Christ that sometimes causes us to lose that wonder. 2 weeks ago, Pastor Russ talked to us about praying to God and speaking to God expectantly. And what struck me about that message, and struck me for quite some time after that message, was that I felt like I had to reevaluate how I talked to God. Because I had stopped talking to God in a way that was expecting him to do amazing things. And that causes us to lose our wonder when we no longer believe that God is working active in our lives. Last week, Pastor Brandon took us on a journey through the universe. You were here for that. That was amazing. And really, we took a look at a couple of things that Pastor Brandon wanted us to look at. We looked at the scale of the universe, just to have an understanding of how big God is if he holds that in his hands. And he had a couple points that stuck with me, and I hope they stuck with you. The first was that he said, we need to stop attempting to make God in our image. So we keep wanting God to fit in our box, to think like us, and act like us, and to look like us, and to talk like us. And that's just not the way it works. And it's very quickly you can lose your wonder in God if you do that. And then we need to embrace the mystery of God. And then we need to stop holding things back. You have to surrender everything. So that was last week. And so here we are in week 4. We're going to finish off wonder. And what I want to do today is I really want to prepare for what was in your need to know. So next week, you're going to have an opportunity, if you come next week, to hear Pastor Russ and Pastor Mark recap 2014 for Hingepoint. What happened here? And then really, and this is the exciting part, look at what 2015 holds in store for this church body, this congregation, and where God's moving. In order to do that, I think that individually we have some prep work to do so that we come next week ready and willing to hear that vision and be able to apply it to what we're doing as a congregation. So what I was going to do is I was going to show you a really cool picture. So now you're going to have to use that imagination of yours. You're going to have to imagine this picture of a rowboat. So you guys have seen the Olympic rowers. They have a really long, slender boat. And there's a bunch of overly muscular guys, normally about 6'6" with 2% body fat. And they're all holding an oar, right? And then if you've watched that sport at all, and we only watch it like once every 4 years when summer levels come on. If you watch that sport at all, there's a really small guy sitting in the front of the boat. In fact, he's so small, it's like a jockey. They have a minimum weight because they kept trying to get that guy lighter and lighter and lighter. So now he can't blow like 160 pounds. They won't let him on there. They got a guy. The position is called the coxswain, and he doesn't have an oar. His job is to set the pace. His job is to steer the. In fact, he's facing the wrong direction, right? He's actually just looking at all these 6'6" guys, and he's setting the pace of the boat, setting the rhythm. He's steering the boat. He's correcting it when it starts to go the wrong direction, the wrong speed. And the reason that's interesting is I want to read to you. We have some amazing things in the New Testament that talk about church. They talk about how church is supposed to work. So I want to read for you, Ephesians 4:11 and 12. Paul says this to the church in Ephesus. And he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and the teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ. All right. Here is where churches often get this wrong. And as you're new to the faith, or going back to the faith, where we often are confused and we need some clarification. See, according to the Bible, the leaders, so our senior pastor, Pastor Russ, Pastor Mark, Pastor Brandon, our leaders were given to us much like the coaches of a rowing boat. They're there to teach us, they're there to correct us, they're there to set the course and plot the course, and when we get off course to correct us that we're on the wrong course, to encourage us. The guys you don't even see on the rowboat. There's a fitness coach, there's a nutrition coach, there are a number of people that are support staff for that boat to do what it's supposed to do. Here's the really interesting thing about those positions. None of them have an oar. And where we get this wrong oftentimes in church is that we take these leaders that God's given us, the amazing leaders that He has called to the faith, and we take all the oars and we give it to them, and we go get a snack, and we get a nice comfy position on the boat, maybe even with a little pad so that it doesn't hurt our bottoms too much while we sit down. We put our feet up, and we say, hey, tell us when we get there, Russ. But that's not the way it works. We don't have the option in church of coming in and saying, hey, Russ, it seems like the boat's kind of slowing down. I mean, there's people missing in children's ministry. We haven't launched a new ministry in some time. I mean, Russ, you should get on that. It's not how it works. If the boat slows down, it's because the people that are supposed to have the oars aren't paddling. If you want to go faster, you can pick up a paddle. It's not a luxury cruise. It's not meant to be. What they say in Ephesus is that the job of the leaders is to prepare the saints for the work of Christ. What I want to do today is I want to do an exercise. This is printed in your bulletin. I really love this. This was originally, I say originally, you might have taken it from somebody. It was originally done by Bill Ibles, who's the senior pastor of Willow Creek Church, and also was a lead speaker at the Willow Creek Leadership Summit. It's a global leadership summit. It's probably the largest of its kind. Over 30,000 people attend the leadership summit for 2 days once a year. Just an absolute amazing leader who's written multiple books. And what he does with his staff, I've done this with my company, with my coworkers, I've done this in the ministry, I've done this in a number of areas, is he wants them to reevaluate where they're at on what he calls the challenge scale. So if you look at your bulletin, there's a challenge scale, and I'll explain it for you. We're gonna all do this. So I hope you have a pen. If not, you can mentally put a dot here. The challenge scale is this. We're going to evaluate if you are under, appropriately, or overly challenged. Now, there are a lot of areas in your life you can be challenged in. You can be extremely challenged at work, or if you have a lot of small kids at home, or relationally, or a lot of areas. But what I want you to do today is we're going to evaluate where you personally are. You're going to do this. You don't have to turn it in. It's not a homework assignment. It's just for you. You're going to evaluate where you are on this scale when it comes to doing God's work in your life. Now, if we back up about 3 or 4 months, you'll know that we've walked through spiritual disciplines. We've walked through invest and invite for 6, 7, 8 weeks here, where we talked about recognizing people God puts in your life and investing in them. And so we've been very focused on God's work. What I want you to do today is I want you to just put a mark down. If you need to divide this up into 0 through 10 because you're a metric person, go right ahead. You can put a little dot down. Are you under challenged when it comes to doing God's work? Are you appropriately challenged? Are you near the bottom of appropriate? Are you at the top of appropriate? Are you in the overly challenged? Or are you in the very, very top? There's a little thing called the danger zone, right? You can only be up there so long before you burn out. Go ahead, put a dot down. Where you personally are when it comes to doing God's work in your life. Let me explain a couple things about the dot you put down. I'm going to use a fitness analogy so you have a good understanding of this. Because this scale will apply a lot when it comes to fitness. So we're in the time of year when roughly 45% of the U.S. population makes this thing called a New Year's resolution. Anyone familiar with that? Come on, who's making New Year's resolutions? There's some liars, because it's 45%. 45% New Year's resolutions. Now, the most popular New Year's resolution, roughly 1/3 or more of all people making New Year's resolutions, will make a resolution to lose weight in 2015. Every year, lose weight. The average for a New Year's resolution is 2 weeks. That's how long you're going to make it on average. I can tell you this. Right? They have a scale. They've done the studies. You make it a week, you make it 2 weeks, 3 weeks, Let's say you're successful, though. Let's say that, and I'll give you some great examples. Let's say my wife and I decided to get back in the gym. This was earlier in the year, so in March. And so early on, we started working out. We could only do so much. So let's say that was that you were extremely out of shape, and so you made two changes in your life. You decided I'm going to walk 2 miles every morning, and I'm going to change my 3,500 calorie diet to 3,000 calories. Let me tell you what, that first week you're going to be very sore, and you're going to be hungry. And week 2 is going to feel a little better, week 3 is going to feel a little better, week 4 is going to feel a little better. But you know what, week 8? Week 8 is going to be like you're not actually doing anything. And week 9 is going to be like this is just normal. And then week 10 is going to roll on. Here's the problem with weeks 8, 9, and 10 if you don't change anything. At some point, walking 2 miles is not enough for you. And if you want to actually make a difference, you're going to have to do something more than that. You're going to have to start jogging that 2 miles, or running that 2 miles, or adding some burpees. Good Lord, not burpees. You're going to have to change from 3,000 calories to 2,500 calories, or 2,300 calories. So you have to make some changes. You're going to have to challenge yourself again, because it's going to become the norm. And what happens when you are under-challenged is you will fail to grow. When you are under-challenged, you will fail to grow. In the opposite, and there are a couple people here at Hingepoint when we got here that were in this category, there is an over-challenged portion. And there's an over-challenged portion that's way, way, way over-challenged. So if when you started working out in our fitness analogy, you decided that right off the bat, even though you're extremely out of shape, you were going to run 5 miles, cut your calories to 1,200 calories, and then do a weightlifting workout in the evening, 6 days a week. Let me tell you about how long that would last for you. Not very long. Because your wife or husband would have to roll you out of bed the next day to be able to move. You can do very productive things in the over-challenged area, especially up high, but you can't do them for very long. Right? It's a quick sprint, you better get back down. The danger is this, guys. The danger is that in the under-challenged and in the over-challenged, that's where you lose your wonder. Because when you're doing God's work, and you're doing too much, and you're doing it too hard, and you're doing it too long, what begins to happen is you start checking boxes instead of doing God's work. When you've been checking boxes, it's because you're doing it for all the wrong reasons. When you're doing it for all the wrong reasons, you begin to lose focus on why you're doing it in the first place. And on the other end, when you're under-challenged, what you begin to realize is that you're along for a ride. And the life that God promised you full of fulfillment actually only happens when you're growing, and you're only growing when you're being challenged. You can't be challenged when you're just taking a ride on a boat. You can't be in either place. All right. Hopefully, you're thinking to yourself, I'm blank challenged today. Right? There's a blank in there for you. I'm appropriately challenged. I'm growing. I'm on fire. I'm passionate. What's happening? I'm under-challenged. I need some challenges. I need the growth. I'm over-challenged. Maybe dangerously over-challenged. Headed toward burnout. We need to stop that. Okay. Let me tie this together so that you understand why we're talking about being over-challenged or under-challenged. When you are only doing things for the sake of doing them, we call that religion. Right? When you're only doing this God stuff to check boxes, we call that religion. We don't necessarily call that faith. We don't call that passionate faith in God. We have a phrase we like to talk about a lot because it's in the New Testament. It says the body comes alive. Right? That in the church, that God's hands and His feet and His mind and the parts of the body are actually parts of the congregation. That when you come alive and you're passionately following God, that the body comes alive. Here's the difference. When we're just checking boxes, it's like taking a dead body and attaching strings to all of the limbs. And those are the rules, the check boxes. And every time we check a box, the puppeteer moves the strings, and the dead corpse sort of flaps a leg or an arm. And we go, look, the body came alive. But you're being honest with yourself. You go, well, that body's not alive. That thing's dead. man, that thing's cold. There's no life there. You're just twitching some limbs every once in a while. And when we stare at religion without faith, when we stare at religion without wondering God, when we stare at religion without passion, it's just a dead corpse twitching some arms and legs. And of course, there's nothing to get excited about when that happens. We want our wonder back. If we want the body to come alive, then we have to have the correct perspective about why we're doing the things we're doing, why we're going to them. It's extremely easy to lose your wonder when you misunderstand church or you allow yourself to become over or under challenged. Wonder, this word wonder, wonder is how we describe passion-filled motivation for pursuing Christ. You should write that down. I'm going to tell you that again. Wonder is how we describe passion-filled motivation for pursuing Christ. And that is required for fulfilling Jesus' vision for the church. You cannot do what Jesus intended the church to do without passion. You cannot do it without wonder. So, we've spent 3 weeks talking about how to get your wonder back, and I don't want to repeat a lot of the things that we've done for 3 weeks. They were great messages, and I'm not capable of doing them the way they were done. But I do want to remind you about a couple things. What I did when I looked at how we get our wonder back is I went and started to read through the Old Testament. The reason I read through the Old Testament is if you know anything about the Old Testament, it's that in roughly a couple thousand years of recorded history of the Israelites, they had this really interesting phenomenon. They really liked to mess up. And, I mean, they were just good at it. They were professional mess-uppers. And what would happen is God would do something amazing for them. And they would respond and be filled with awe and wonder about the Almighty God. And it would last about a generation or less. Sometimes it would last a couple weeks. And then they would stray from God. And they would do something amazingly stupid as a people. Like begin worshiping the idols or gods of their neighbors. Or begin just living completely without God. And God would send a prophet. And most of our Old Testament books are actually named after the prophets that God sent to reinvigorate wonder into the people. And there was a pattern for them. They all did roughly the same thing. And I want to go through those with you today. And since we're not going to have our cool screen to show you the underlined fill in the blanks, I'm going to give it to you ahead of time so you can write it down. They did 3 things over and over and over again. The first thing they did was they reminded the people of who God is. Reminded the people of who God is. The second thing they did was they reflected on what God had already done. And the third thing they did was they reoriented the people with God's promises yet to come. So they reminded, they reflected, they reoriented. So I want to do that with you today. I want to do a little reminding and reflecting and reorienting. Let's talk about this biblical example of how to get our wonder back and get prepared for next week. So, who God is. Pastor Brandon did one of the best jobs I've ever heard at putting God in terms of his scale and his power into some sort of context for us. So if you were here last week when he began to talk about just the size and scale of the universe, it's one of those things where I think at the end he said, I could have, God's big, and dropped the mic and walked off, right? Because he's amazing. I want to read to you 5 verses today. Most of these are from the Old Testament where God is just reminding the people of who he is. So let's go through these. This is the nature of God. Numbers 23:19. God is not man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill? God is a promise keeper. All right. Let's turn to Deuteronomy 4:31. For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not leave you or destroy you or forget the covenant with your fathers that he swore to. God's a merciful God. Deuteronomy 9:3. Know therefore today that he who goes over before you as a consuming fire is the Lord your God. He will destroy them and subdue them before you. So you shall drive them out and make them perish quickly as the Lord has promised you. Your God is a protector. his heart to all generations. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen as his heritage. The Lord looks down from heaven. He sees all the children of man. God remembers each of us individually. And lastly, I want to take you all the way back to 2 Corinthians 9:8. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. God is the enabler. We talk about doing this thing called church. We're able to do it because God enables those things. He empowers those things in our lives. My takeaway from Brandon's message last week was that we need to stop making God in our image. I had a pastor, though, that used to say something very similar to that. He used to say, you need to stop trying to sit in God's seat. And what he meant by that was, we typically are always dealing with a control issue. Right? We want to control our own future, we want to control our decisions, we want to control how things go, and we really begin to get scared when we think we're losing control, even though the greatest trick is that we've never had it in the first place. But we like this idea that where we trick ourselves that we have control over situations. And so what we consistently then do is we try to put ourselves in God's seat where we can make those decisions. And when you have a correct perspective of who God is, you realize you need to get out of the seat. Because you're not going to be able to do what God does. You need to get out of the seat so he can do what he does. Okay. I want to reflect on what God has already done. But to do that, instead of going through some Bible stories, and I encourage you, if you're wondering what God has already done, there's a whole lot of examples of that that you can go through and read. Right? The Bible is pretty chock full of some amazing things that God's done. But instead of that today, I want to tell you what I do when I begin to lose my wonder. When I'm reflecting on what God's done, I don't reflect on Bible stories from 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, even though those are amazing. When I'm beginning to lose my wonder in God, passion, I reflect back on what God has done in my life, in my family's life, and the people around me, because I've seen those things. Tim Keller is an amazing pastor back east, and he's done a number of small group studies and books. And he has a small group study that here some of our groups have gone through, and it's called Reason for God. And Reason for God is Tim Keller sitting in a room with 6 or 7 very intelligent, very professional individuals who are all non-believers. And the only reason they're in the room is because they are non-believers. They do not believe in God. And so he begins to ask them very, very spiritual questions just to hear how people who don't believe in God try to rationalize away different things. And it's, if you haven't seen it, it's amazing. Like, you sit there with your jaw down, it's like, that's the thing. It's tough to understand the dynamic. But one of the guys challenges Tim in the middle of a session. He looks back at him and he goes, well, let me ask you, could someone present enough evidence that you would no longer believe in God? I mean, if someone had enough, can you imagine a scenario where someone has enough evidence that would show you that God doesn't exist? And Tim Keller, he thinks about it and he goes, well, because I think there's two parts to that answer. Because intellectually, I assume that I'm just not the smartest guy ever, and then at some point someone can give me enough evidence that sure could convince me. Because but the problem that I have with that is that no amount of evidence could ever erase the things that God has done in my life. I can't change that because they happened. And when they've happened, it doesn't matter the intellectual side, because I watched them happen. And it happened to me, and I remember how I felt when they happened. So when I'm reflecting back on what God has already done, I'm reflecting on what God has already done. And I'm remembering that feeling of when I saw God work. Because we've all had scenarios and times in our life when God has shown us His glory. When God has moved in our lives. When God has moved in a relative's life. When God has moved into a situation that seemed unrecoverable. And when those things happen, we are in awe of God. And then, like everybody else, it fades and we forget. And when we want to reorient ourselves again, we need to reflect back on what happened, what God did, and how we felt when that happened. Let me give you a couple stories. My wife and I had been married about 3 months, and she had gone to the doctor for a routine checkup, and the doctor found something and said, we have to schedule you for a procedure. And I was at work, and I got a phone call. And she said, I've got to go in for a procedure. I'm going in this afternoon. And I'm like, I didn't even know anything was wrong. I thought you were going in for a checkup. What's happening? Well, the doctor found this cyst or something. And I have to go in, and they're going to do this procedure where they scrape it off, and so on and so forth. And I'm like, okay, I don't even, what is this? I don't understand. And she said, well, they're not sure, but they've scheduled me this afternoon. And I said, I had an overwhelming feeling that something was wrong. And we prayed, and I said, just cancel it and go see another doctor. And so she canceled it, and the next day she went in and she saw another doctor. And they said, we figured out what the problem is. And we were like, oh, wow, it's quick. Normally you're taking tests and waiting for weeks. And they said, yeah, you're pregnant. And the other pregnancy test that the other doctor did just didn't work. And that cyst is your baby. And if you scrape it off, it's going to die. And that's my daughter, Avery. And I like to reflect back on what God did. Because the line between my firstborn and it being my secondborn was a fine line. And that was God moving in our life. And I remember distinctly going down to the doctor's office to see my wife and thinking, God is moving. God is working. I grew up as a pastor's kid. About age 4, my dad moved the family to Fort Worth, Texas, because he felt like he was being called to go into the ministry. And we lived in Long Beach at the time. So we moved to Texas, and we lived on campus for 4 years since he went through seminary. He got his first church in a town called Raleigh, California, which is the absolute dead center of nowhere. 8,000 people in the summer, 15,000 people in the winter. Right next to Glamis sand dunes. Nowhere. And my dad had a salary of $18,000 a year. My mom didn't work. Some health issues. He had 4 kids. And we mowed lawns on Monday to make enough money to pay the bills. And oftentimes that wasn't enough, particularly after a hospital stay. And I clearly remember, probably 9 or 10, my parents didn't have enough money to cover the bills. It wasn't going to happen. Savings are exhausted. Ain't no other jobs to get. $18,000 a year, 4 kids, it's rough. And Dad gets the mail. And he opens up the mail, and there's a letter from a guy he hasn't heard from in years. And it said, I was praying for you. I don't know why, but I think you need this. There's a check for $1,000. We were $1,000 short. And I remember my parents crying. And I remember growing up thinking, that's just how God works. I didn't know him. It didn't happen once. It happened twice. With different people that they hadn't heard from years. At different times when they couldn't pay their bills. And I remember growing up thinking, that's just how it works. So when I'm reflecting back on things God's done, I can think all the way back into my childhood and remember that when God moves, we should pay attention. And when we have need, God's there to respond. I was going to college, so about 2 years into college, and I was about as far from God as I'd ever been in my life. There is a transition that many of you know that when you leave your house, particularly if you have a very Bible-loving family and a good Christian family, that you decide maybe that was just them and that's not me, and I'm going to run as far away as I can. So I did Jonah, and I ran as far as I could before getting swallowed. And I was not going to church and doing it as little as possible as I could for my faith, attempting to ignore God. And we had a cafeteria across the street from campus with all these different vendors. And on Sunday mornings they were all closed, but they would keep the cafeteria open and you'd sit in there. And I have no idea why I was open on Sunday morning because I wasn't going to church. But I decided to go to that cafeteria where no one was at, and I was sitting by myself, and I could hear someone singing hymns. So that was really interesting. And there was a manager's office up above the cafeteria, and there was a church that had been started that met in that office on Sunday mornings. It's the only place they could afford to rent. And that church consisted of about 25 people, maybe. And I remember realizing I'm supposed to be there. And I walked upstairs, and I sat sat in that service, and those people, over the course of the next year or two, began to minister to me and to love on me, to offer me an environment to reinvigorate my faith, and to realize that the way I was brought up was actually what I believed. And it was, again, one of those middle of nowhere scenarios where I'm running as far as I can, and I can't get away from the church above the cafeteria. I ended up living with that pastor's family for a year, renting a room and learning from them. And it absolutely greatly affected my life and my walk with Christ, and how I got back on a path where I understood what God wanted for me. That church was a church plant from Erwin McManus's church in Mosaic, which is one of the most amazing and creative churches, and it's so amazingly similar to Hingepoint that sometimes I can't tell the difference between the two. And here, full circle, I come back and we end up at Hingepoint. I realize this is something that God has been planning for years and years and years. So when you get to a point where you feel like you're losing your way, you need to take some time and reflect on the things that God has already done. Because we as a body, we as a people, we as humans, have a tendency to forget the things that God has done so fast and constantly wonder what God has done lately. What have you done for me lately, God? But we need to reflect back on what God has done already. The third thing that the prophets often did was to reorient people with God's promises yet to come. We talked 2 weeks ago, Pastor Russ talked a lot about what Jesus said we would do as a church, that we would do even greater miracles than he did during his life. And I don't want to go through all of God's promises for us. I do want to read you a story. And I came across this story a couple weeks ago in my quiet time. It's actually from the book of Daniel. And I'll set it up for you. But it struck me for days. So Daniel's an Israelite, and he's in captivity. And King Nebuchadnezzar has rules over most of the known earth at that time. So they have an amazingly powerful kingdom. And the Jewish people have been enslaved. Daniel is a slave, but he's also well respected. So we've seen that Daniel's in the lion's den and a number of other stories. This is early Daniel chapter 2. The king has a dream. And he's greatly disturbed by this dream because he continues to have it. So he goes to all of his wise men and he tells them, interpret this dream for me. And they say, no problem, give us the dream. King Nebuchadnezzar is pretty smart dude. He says, no, if I give you the dream, you're going to tell me what I want you to hear. If you're that wise, you tell me what the dream is, and then you tell me what it means. That didn't go over real well, because no one can do it. And so he gets really angry, because you're not wise in it at all. And he puts out a decree, if you can't tell me what my dream was, what it meant, I'm going to kill every single one of them. Well, they were motivated, but they couldn't do it. So they go to Daniel. And Daniel gets with his fellow Israelites and gets down and he prays. He says, God, tell me what the dream is, and tell me what I need to know. And God gives it to him. And he walks into King Nebuchadnezzar's royal palace, and he lays it down for him. We're going to read that today. This is Daniel chapter 2. I'm going to read to you verses 31 through 47. We're going to skip a couple in the middle. I'll summarize it. Verse 31. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image mighty and of exceeding brightness stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them into pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold, all together were broken in pieces and became like chaff on the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of heaven, making you ruler over them all. You are the head of gold. He goes on to tell the king that inferior kingdoms will continue to rise up and conquer the more superior kingdom again and again and again and in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and the interpretation is sure. He walks into the most powerful ruler in the world, and he says, let me tell you what you dream. Kingdom after kingdom is going to rise up and fall, and rise up and fall, and rise up and fall. God's already written the end. He's going to create a kingdom that will conquer all of these. He will shatter them, and he will create a kingdom that will cover the earth and will stand forever. He's written the end. Let me tell you how important that promise is. The scale of that. The most powerful ruler in the world. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering of incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. King Nebuchadnezzar is a smart guy. And what he realizes is that God has written the ending already. God's made some promises. There are a number. What you need to know if you're reorienting yourself with those promises and reflecting on those in your wonder is the ending has already been written. And we win. I'll just let you know. We win. That's a great ending. We win. When you've lost your wonder and it's become about checking boxes instead of being amazed by what God has done, you need to remember that the ending has already been written, and we win. If that doesn't fill you with wonder, I don't know what will. Here's what I want you to do with us today. Next week, we're going to come back in here, and we're going to have an opportunity to listen to not only what has happened in 2014 in this church, but to have an understanding of what God has in store for us in 2015. But to be prepared to listen to that and do something practical with that vision, we need to have reflected across this week about ourselves, how we view God, and how we've lost our wonder. And if you have, these are some things you can do to get them back. Come back next week filled with wonder and ready to hear the vision for the church. Don't allow being over-challenged or under-challenged when it comes to doing God's work. Stop the passion for pursuit of Christ. And I'd like you to do this week. The band's going to come up. We're going to close this in prayer. But I'd like you to do this week. Every day, as you sit down and you pray, you have a quiet time with the Lord. Ask God this. Ask God to speak to you clearly, so that not only can you hear Him to reinvigorate that wonder in your life, but so that you can hear His direction for where this church is going in 2015. Let's pray. God, we thank you for being an awesome God. We thank you for being the God of gods, King of kings, and revealer of mysteries. And thank you, Father, for who you are. And thank you again and again and again for what you've done. God, for what you've done in my life, in my family, those around me, in this church, in this community, God, in this world, these people. Thank you for your Son. God, speak to each of us individually this week as we prepare to come next week. God, thank you for our leaders. Thank you for our pastors, our teachers. God, help us to row and to know why we row, to not lose sight of you.